Hello, everybody. This is Robert Barden at North Carolina State University. I'll be hosting today's webinar, which is brought to us by the North Carolina Tree Farm Program. Today's topic is building trails on your property. Before we introduce the presenter and the host, I want to touch a little bit on logistics for the webinar. Today, we'll be taking questions and answers using the Q&A function of Zoom. So if you have a question for our presenter, please type it into that Q&A feature. If you run into some other issue and you need to get a hold of me, please use the chat for that. The reason we do that is we don't want to lose anybody's questions. If it gets buried into the chat, sometimes those get missed, and we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer everybody's questions. We will be answering questions at the end of today's presentation, but as you get your questions, please enter them into that feature. We also made copies of today's slides available on the Forestry portal where you joined today's webinar. You'd be able to get a copy of them there, as well as the URLs for any of the websites that are mentioned in today's webinar. They are also available on the Forestry webinar portal for today's webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Leslie McCormick, who's with the North Carolina Tree Farm Program. Leslie?
Thanks, Bob. Good morning, good afternoon. Glad all of you are here with us. I am pleased to introduce Ann Savage as our speaker for today's webinar. She is an Extension Associate with North Carolina State Extension, where she oversees resource and program development that enables the growth of prosperous and sustainable tourism destinations across North Carolina. Ann collaborates with extension offices and specialists throughout the state to support tourism management and development, outdoor recreation, and economic development initiatives. Some of her recent projects include working with Visit NC, the North Carolina Division of State Parks, Recreation Resources Services, the Year of the Trail, and the North Carolina Oyster Trail. Today, she's going to be talking to us about building trails on your property. Ann, we're delighted you're here with us, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me, Leslie. Let me get this presentation out. And Leslie mentioned quite a few trails that I work on. Some of them are trails like I'll be talking about today, and others are more cultural in nature. But thanks everybody for being here. My name's Ann Savage. I'm a Tourism Extension Associate at NC State. And so our objective today is we're going to start off going over trail considerations before you even think about or get to the design phase of putting trails on your property. Then we'll go a little deeper into trail design. I do have one slide that's about trail construction, but really I don't want to delve too far into that, but I'll give you some resources for places to look if you are constructing trails. We'll get into trail maintenance. And then because I am a tourism person and I'm all about visitors, we'll talk a little bit about if you're going to have visitors to your property, things to think about, and some regulations here in North Carolina. So starting off with trail considerations, I think one of the first things you need to do is look at the goals of your property, understanding what your management or stewardship plan has involved in it, and thinking about how trails can align with that, making sure that trails are helping you get to that goal. And so for this slide, we're going to have a little bit of a poll because I want to see what your thoughts are about why you want to have trails on your property. You should be able to select all that apply with the poll. And so people from all walks of life escape to trails for solitude, wildlife viewing, exercise, and to spend time with friends and family. As a landowner, you have the opportunity to create that experience for yourself and whomever you'd like to have. So we'll give maybe 30 more seconds for y'all to let us know, and please select all that apply there to let us know what you're interested in with trails on your property. All right, I think that's a good amount of time. All right, so most people want recreation and wildlife viewing, some for controlling wildfire. I will say I don't delve too far into that today. That's not an area that I have expertise. For our forestry extension team, we have some folks that really do great work with wildfire. And so if you have any specific questions about trails and wildfire, we can try to help you out there. Some hunting, 30% hunting, 24% other, but most folks are wanting to do that recreation and wildlife viewing, which is great because that's really what I focused on for this presentation. Okay. And so thinking about trail considerations, there are really 5 main things we need to think about before we get started. So kind of great that a lot of folks want to do recreation. I'm interested in how you want to use these trails, if it's for walking, hiking, biking, using ATVs, or riding horses. So we have a poll to kind of get a sense of that as well. And so again, you can select all that apply for you. And so well-designed trails have users in mind so that we can think about what sort of difficulty levels people want and think about the different levels that we need to adhere to. We'll give about 30 more seconds here. Okay, most people want to go walking and hiking, 85%. That's great. That's what we're going to talk about a lot today. We will do a little shout out to biking. ATVs is kind of a whole different beast. There's a lot of resources out there if folks do have questions about ATVs. Some 6% equestrian and 17% other. I wish there was a way that I could have asked for the other because I love to get that information. But that walking, hiking's what we're going to talk mostly about today. So that's great. So one of the main things that you're going to see as a theme as we talk about design and maintenance is water on trails, thinking about how to keep water off of trails. And then ultimately this will help with whatever your maintenance cost is if you can design well with water in mind. And then wildlife and plant impacts. The goal here is to minimize disturbances, avoid cutting trails through undisturbed areas, try when possible to align them along natural or human created edges, and avoid areas of known sensitive species to keep trails narrow or to limit those disruptions in those areas. Some other considerations are soil types. A mixture of sand, silt, and clay is best, but we know that's not always possible. Remember, we are going to talk about water, so this is where soil becomes kind of a big role in that. And visual appeal. Obviously, you probably have some lovely places on your property that you want to get to. These could be waterways, park-like landscapes, interesting or large trees. And so we want to, again, ensure that minimal impact on wildlife out there and support our ecological functions. So designing trails that are both visually pleasing and supportive of minimal ecological disturbances. So now we've kind of outlined what we want to do. I know that most of the folks here are interested in recreation. They're wanting to hike and walk on the trails. And so identifying how we're going to interact with those trails, what our difficulty level that we know we want to do, and what the purpose of them are when we're looking at the overall goals of our property, so we can start to design. And we're going to design our trails with maintenance in mind. And remember, maintenance ties back to water. So just some general pictures here of trails. This is a backpacking trail. So these are single file sort of trails. It's about 24 inches of that tread. And typically this sort of trail has 4 feet wide and 8 feet high of trail that's clear. This picture is obviously very clear because there aren't a lot of trees there. But so these sorts of trails often have the lowest environmental impacts because they're so small, and they oftentimes prevent trail widening. So if you're just interested in hiking alone, this is a great option for something on your property. But if you're interested in hiking with others, maybe you have grandkids or kids that you want to take out, or there's a group of school students that you want to take to show nature, these nature trails are a little bit wider, so they allow for kind of a double file sort of situation. And so they're generally 6 feet wide with that 8 feet high of clearance. That's a typical trail corridor zone. They commonly have trail tread of 3 feet wide or larger. And oftentimes those larger areas are where people might stop and look, like these children are doing in this picture, to get a sense of some sort of educational piece or something that's visually pleasing. Equestrian trails, we didn't have many folks that were interested in the horse trails, but we have to think about both the horse and the rider. So typically we need a little bit higher of a clearance. So that's that 10 to 12 feet, and a little bit wider for that 8 feet of the corridor zone. And these are really, if you have old logging roads or jeep trails on your property, this is great. This is a great spot to put those equestrian trails. And then mountain biking trails, I'm not going to talk much about today. There's some great resources, but these are pretty thin, like the backpacking trails, 18 to 24 inches is really all you need for that tread. You'll need that 6 foot wide by 8 feet high of the corridor zone, but there are other things you have to think about, like two-way traffic on bikes, multi-use. Do you want hikers and bikers using these trails? Would they be using them at the same time? Sightline clearance for if there are any jumps, or thinking about somebody on a bike and what they need to see in the future, and the tread of those trails. The International Mountain Bicycling Association has more information about trail construction. They're a great resource if you're interested in mountain biking trails on your property. So now we're going to get into more of the technicalities here. So if you don't have a topographic map of your property, there should be a link that's coming in the chat that's showing you a place where you can go and find that topographic map. That's going to come in really handy when you're doing your trail design. A clinometer, which we'll talk about in a minute, also doesn't hurt, because we're going to talk a lot about angles, because angles have to do with water. So grade generally should be less than 10%. And this is where soil type really comes into play. If it's a highly erosive soil, like a sandy soil, 5% could be an excessive grade for a sandy soil, and it could erode pretty quickly. But if it's more of a granitic soil or soils with substantial rock components, they're more forgiving and can allow up to a 13 to 15% grade. But an important thing when you're thinking about grading your trail is what's going to be comfortable for a user. And typically 10% or less is something that most users enjoy walking on. Maybe some small sections where it's a little bit more intense, but you are designing this for you. So making sure that it's something that's enjoyable is important. Trail alignment angles are important when we're thinking about grade in our building the trail. So this trail A on here shows a fall line, which is perpendicular to our contour lines. These are our contour lines here. They tell us how high we are. If we're walking along a contour line, we're at a 0% grade. This trail is the fall line. So it's where water will run. When in a rainstorm, it's going to flow right down. And so building a trail there, you're just basically creating a place for water to flow down this hill that you have here. So what they like to do is there's a half rule for creating trails on these topographic maps. And so the half rule provides guidance and keeps so it shouldn't exceed half the grade of the hillside or slope. So we see here this trail B is longer, but it's only 5% instead of this 10% slope, to help keep water from flowing directly down this trail. And there are some more steps in this that we're going to get to on the next couple slides, but just know that the path of least resistance for you up is also the path of least resistance for water down. So trying to think what's the best way to organize that. So outsloping is one way to help when you're building a trail on a hill. A well-designed trail should have a 3 to 5% outsloped cross-section, so water runoff crosses the trail in a non-erosive sheet flow rather than being intercepted by the trail and channeled in. This happens naturally when people go on trails. You see in stage 1, this is where we started. Stage 2, people walk in the center of trails or they walk closer to the slope. So you see that berm forming on the downhill side of it. So outsloping requires a lot of maintenance. It's not necessarily always very difficult maintenance, but it's something you always have to be aware of when you're working on your trails. You can start with steeper slopes than 5%, but sometimes that makes folks nervous. I know I don't particularly like sloping if it's a pretty steep hill. So it's just something to be aware of. But this outsloping helps give water a natural place to run down, so it's not using your trail as that place. So one way to help with outsloping is to incorporate grade dips on your trail. And so they're typical distances based off of the grade. So 3 to 5%, you want a grade dip every 500 feet, 7 to 10%, you want them every 300 feet. And so grade dips force all water running down the tread to leave the trail before it can gain in volume, momentum, and erosive power. The spacing of these features depends on the trail grade, and we see that there. Recommended spacing is included in this table. A significant benefit of trail grades is that they require low maintenance, if really ever, and they provide reasonable gain in trail elevation. So you can see here how we have the trail that's going up, and then you have your grade dip, so the water flows off. Or you can ramp your trail up a little bit on the second one to have that natural flow of water out. So while you're designing your trails and thinking about all these different angles and whatnot, take your map and your clinometer. And the clinometer is just something to show you the angle of the land you're looking at. And so that's why having your topographic map is great. But taking your map out so you can look at kind of the following things. So if you know there's a point of interest that you want to have on the trail, making sure you've marked that so you can see if it's something that's you can actually see from where you're designing your trail by your maps, or seeing maybe where you need to get a little closer and what sort of angles might be involved in that. Looking for crossings, both road and stream crossings need to be researched thoroughly to understand potential dangers and importance these points might have on your route. Streams are subject to fluctuations, sometimes as much as 5 to 10 feet. So making sure that you know if perhaps a bridge might be necessary there, or some sort of reroute that's more doable for what your capabilities are with building the trail. Level areas, so long straight trails are generally not the most aesthetically pleasing. And so finding ways to add in different curves, even if just every couple 100 feet, you have some slight left and right curves to add some variability in what folks are seeing, is something to look for. Steep hillsides, steep areas present situations where careful trail location and design is essential. So if you're new to building trails, I wouldn't suggest going to steep hillsides. And when possible, you should avoid locating trails there. But some soil types allow for more of this. So if you have like that more granitic soil, again, you can have some more of those steep hillsides that you can work with, but best to stay away if there's a possibility of it. And then also just noting technical spots on the map. And this map that you're making all these designations on will really help you when you go back to look and try to look for maintenance options. So trail construction, if you have never built a trail before and you're interested in building trails, it's always good to find a local trail building organization near you so that you can go and volunteer, learn some of the ways to do things from folks that have the experience. Or if you know somebody that builds trails, having them come out to kind of talk you through those processes. So first, thinking about how to lay out your trail, so getting plastic surveyor's tape so you understand where the trail is going to go. You can kind of outline that. That could be something you do with your map when you're kind of writing these points of interest and going and walking that trail a few times to make sure it's something that makes sense. You'll take your compass and your clinometer out there, and then 25-foot tape measures are always helpful. For building the trail, there are all sorts of tools involved. The American Trails Organization has great resources on kind of what different tools you'll need to use. For hand tools, make sure you're using safety precautions. So thinking, and if it's you or somebody else you're having out on your property, you're thinking about the ways to carry these tools safely, especially if people are going down or uphill to where they can throw the tool if they're falling. Having people know how to carry but also use these tools is essential, and having safety zones is important. Power tools and equipment, knowing the proper use and field maintenance of all power tools is important, making sure those around you that are working with you know how to use this. Chainsaws are often common in trail work as they are in a lot of forestry work. I know our forestry extension team does chainsaw workshops. So if that's something that you'd be interested in, I'd keep your eyes out for that, just so you can learn how to safely use those power tools. And make sure you're always wearing personal protective gear when you're using these. And then oftentimes trails involve rock work. If you have rocks on your property, some people love this part of the trail building experience, but it definitely takes some skills. So I would definitely try to have somebody that's done this before come out. And there are several hazards and ways to minimize those that are associated with it. So thinking about when you move a rock, what's involved, how you're going to communicate about moving the rock, and making sure everybody involved in that process knows what's going on. And so trail maintenance is what we're going to focus on for our next few slides. And so water is really what we're talking about here. So one of the first steps for trail maintenance, and this could be even while you're developing the trail, is getting outside and taking a hike in a rainstorm, looking at how water flows in the place that you're interested in having this trail, marking those areas where it could be prone to erosion or muddiness, so that you can really keep your eye on it as you're going through the building and maintenance process. So after you build your trail, identifying segments in need of rerouting is always a part of maintenance. And so these are segments where really it's beyond control of implementing any sort of other trail capabilities. It's affecting the environment around it. Remember, we want to minimize what's happening with we want to minimize the disturbances on the ecological area around. So if we see that there are issues that are beyond our control, then it's time to do a little bit of rerouting, which is never the good news. Maintaining the outslope is, remember I said there was a lot of maintenance involved with the outslope. So it is one of the most labor-intensive maintenance tools, and trails are usually constructed with that 3 to 5% outslope. Normal trail use compacts that inside and displaces the soil like we talked about earlier. If this erosion is allowed to continue unchecked, the trail trench will deepen until it's both unstable and unredeemable. So we can see that kind of here in our step 1, step 2, step 3. We're seeing that there's now vegetation that's growing on the side here, which is going to make it difficult. And stage 4 is where it's gotten too deep. And so sometimes you can implement so sometimes all you need to do, if it's at stage 2, it hasn't gotten to this stage 3 yet, is to take this buildup on the side, this berm, and pull it over so that you still have that 3 to 5% grade. So that means you're checking quite often. So whenever you start to see that berm form, you just go out there and you even it out and add your outslope there. Sometimes this is really not possible because of the conditions. If the soil is sandy, if you have a lot of traffic there, or if you've had a lot of rain, it could be kind of a lost cause. And so other methods employed to divert this is using drainage dips and water bars, which we'll talk about in the next. So that's when you put logs or rocks along the trail that give a natural place for water to run off, and there's a higher piece in front of it. And those drainage dips and water bars follow the same distance patterns as grade dips, like we talked about earlier. So drainage support, if you do put in some of these drainage dips and water bars, that's what we're seeing here with those stones across the park, across the path, and the wood across the path. You need to clean them out at least 2 times a year, but this is also highly dependent on how much rain. You see a lot of leaf litter on this one. We want to make sure that litter doesn't build up and that water is still able to flow off the trail easily instead of flowing down the trail. For vegetation, like we talked about earlier, for hiking, generally you have that trail corridor that's 6 feet horizontally and 8 feet vertically that's cleared. And so keeping vegetation kind of out of that trail corridor is important. So we want to focus on blown down trees, obviously. If you have any of those, getting that chainsaw out and making sure you get it off the property or off the path. And tree branches we remember we're designing to limit our maintenance. So just cutting the branch back might not be the best option because you'll have more branches come off. So cutting it close, about less than 1 inch from that trunk can help you get not as many offshoots there. Tree saplings, when they get greater than 2 inches in diameter and they're within that 6 feet wide, cutting them down as close to the ground as you can. It is better to remove shrubs, the trail corridor, as trimming them can stimulate more growth. And then thinking about ground vegetation, just using a powered string trimmer or weed cutter with a grass brush blade is efficient. We want to try to keep your ferns and herbs, if they're not directly in the path, they're really not doing any harm there. And then learn how to identify non-native species that are in the area of your trail. This is where, even if you have identified some that are in that trail area, kind of thinking about how to keep clearing that out, even up to 20 feet wide of the trail, because once they drop their seedlings, you'll be chasing after them pretty frequently. So that's maintaining to give you less maintenance in the future, to really keep an eye out for those. And then safety, I've talked about safety a little bit with tools, but just in general with any sort of trail maintenance, safety is a really important thing to have on your mind. So if people are coming out and helping you with anything, just make sure that there's good communication. Everybody knows what their role is. And then also you have a source of communication while you're out there, a good first aid kit, and you're doing safety practices. Okay, so now trails and the public are visitors to our trails. This could be, you invite a school group, you invite some educational group onto your property, you have friends of the family that come out. And so things to think about as folks come. In 1995, there was legislation that was set to protect folks opening up their property for free access to land and for recreation and education. And this was for folks in North Carolina. I saw some people before we get started in the chat talk about being from other states. I'm not sure what your legislation is. I do know, talking to people in North Carolina who work on trails, telling me that this is one of the strongest legislative pieces they've seen to protect landowners with trails on their property. Those are the trails people's perceptions. So if you have a different one, perhaps. And so, but there are several exceptions to this rule. One is something that you have to do if you own property in general, and that's to warn and protect against those attractive nuisances. And so these are considered anything that's a continuing danger or permanent condition that may inflict injury because of the likelihood it might be visited by a youth. So they don't necessarily have to be attractive, but if you have like a pond or a dock or an old building that a kid might find interesting and go and explore and then have some sort of accident happen, that is an attractive nuisance. And so making sure you have some way to either fence or remove that nuisance is important. We know that oftentimes you can't remove a pond necessarily, but a good fence that's well maintained is a great deterrent there. You also must inform invitees of artificial or unusual hazards. This is something you also have to do if you just have property. So making sure folks know if there's guard dogs or hunters, or there's an area that's unstable, like a cliff that folks might go out onto, particularly if your trail is anywhere near that cliff, making sure folks know not to go there. So keeping the people safe, giving them the knowledge they need to be safe while they're on your property is important. Some other things that the liability limitations don't apply to is instances where an invitee uses the land for a purpose for which the land is regularly used, but there's a cost associated with it. So one of the examples is an invitation to a free fishing day at a commercial fishing operation. So you waive the fee for the day, but it's not typically free, so it's not covered under this limitation. And it's also voided when the extension of an invitation or the granting of permission is used to promote a commercial enterprise. So if you have a horseback riding business and you're bringing people onto your property just to see what the horseback riding opportunities are, that would not be part of this limitation. So just having people on your property in general, so anytime you have people on your property, there could be things that go wrong, serious injury or death. And so whenever that happens, obviously there's likely going to be a lawsuit. From the previous slides, that's set up to protect people a little bit more if that lawsuit comes, so that the landowner perhaps isn't as at fault. But always talk to your lawyer and your insurance agent about good liability insurance before bringing people onto your property. Make sure they know where they're going, what they're doing, what you're interested in having, just as a good practice. Make sure you have proper posting. If you have private land, there's a lot of information that'll be on our last slide with information about what you should do to put this proper posting up so people know where they're trespassing and where they're not trespassing. And then we talked about warning users and fencing or removing attractive nuisances. So I've kind of labeled those first ones as active. You're inviting people to your land. And these are the more passive ways. So passive being having some sort of written agreement or leases where folks can come onto your property, and it really limits or delineates the landowner's liabilities. And so easements are one way to do this. A trail easement is a situation where the landowner makes their land available for a public trail without having to subdivide the land or lose ownership of that land. And the easement goes with the land. So even if the landowner moves away, the trail will permanently be protected. So this is a great opportunity if you know there are trails around and you're not really interested in building them yourselves or whatnot. Easements are a great thing to look into. The conservation organizations around the state work a lot with private property owners who are interested in building into trail system. And the NC State Trails has laid out a pretty solid document that outlines kind of what the process is for setting an easement up with them and how long it will take and the different things that they'll need. There's also the opportunity for people to purchase land. I figured that wouldn't be the most popular option here, but just had to mention that. And so trails in public, this is more for my agritourism work, but I think it's important that if you're thinking about having folks out on your property, even if they're small groups, you really need to think about what people need when they come. So interacting with people is first. Do you enjoy talking to people? Will you have to interact with people? What are those interactions going to entail? Do you want people to learn something while they're there? Have you set up kind of that educational process? So just making sure that you're prepared for those interactions if you're interested in having people out there. And then more logistical things like, where are people going to park? Is it something that could affect your neighbors? Or would it make sure your county zoning and whatnot know about if people are coming out often to go out there, because they're going to want to make sure there's safe entrances and exits and places to park. So it's always good to have conversations with folks about that. And then people are hiking, they bring snacks, making sure you have trash places for people to throw their trash so that trash pickup doesn't become part of your regular maintenance. I just put bathrooms and infrastructure because sometimes if people are out on trails, they've got to go and they're creative in what they discover there. Signage, this could be interpretive if you're interested in having something like that, but also making sure people know the boundaries of where they're allowed to go and not allowed to go, and that it's very clearly delineated on your property. And then anytime you invite people, making sure that you have a plan for emergency. Things happen, so making sure that there's clear roles for whoever is working with you on this property to know who does what in the event of an emergency. It's always good to talk to your local emergency officials if people are out on your property, to kind of show them where the trails are, let them know when groups come out, so if something does happen, they can help respond quicker. And so there's a resource from the University of Vermont. It's a farm-based education network. And so they put together this booklet. They do have a lot of farms that have trails on them for hiking, running, cross-country skiing, which isn't quite as popular here. But there are some resources there of things to think about if you want to host people on your property. And so I put this up here basically to say I am not legal advice. I kind of went over some legal things, but make sure that you talk to competent legal advice before you go into any written agreements, but also before you have people coming out into your property and signing any liability situations. And then lastly, this is our big resource slide. So American Trails is a great organization. They put together all sorts of research, resources, and webinars about building trails, maintaining trails. A lot of it is focused on more local parks and recreation agencies, but there's still a lot there that could be beneficial for you. A lot of the things that I talked about today came from some resources that they had on their website that came from folks that were researching at universities. And so I just wanted to highlight one thing. They have a webinar coming up in December about trail planning and designing foundations of success. So if you want to go a little bit deeper with folks that have real technical expertise in this, I would suggest maybe looking into going to that webinar. And then the other resources I included here were things that I was basically using to help promote or to put together this slideshow. And so with that, I will take questions.
And before we go into questions, so folks, this is the time for you. If you have questions for Ann, please type them into the Q&A feature. And we'll give her a moment to take a breath. And Leslie would like to talk about Tree Farm for a second.
Yes, thank you, Ann, for that presentation. Just wanted to let you know that this webinar has been sponsored by the North Carolina Tree Farm Program. This is the last of our quarterly webinars for the year, and we'll be making plans for next year, so stay tuned for that. If you want more information about the North Carolina Tree Farm Program and the educational opportunities we provide, you can find us on our website. With addresses here, email us or give us a call, and we'd be happy to talk with you. And if you have suggestions for future topics, we'd love to hear from you on that too. Thank you so much, Ann.
All right, let's see. We will get to our questions. So first question is from Debbie Dillon, and she's wondering, are there any resources for grants for nonprofits to help with expense of building trails?
Yeah, there's quite a few grants out there. I would, if you're a nonprofit and you have property, maybe reaching out to local conservation groups or even your Parks and Rec departments to see what options they have. If you're in North Carolina, we have a resource called Recreation Resources Service, and they work a lot with our local park, like our municipal Parks and Rec folks, but they also are really in tune with what sort of grant opportunities there are for nonprofits. It depends on what you're looking at, what the scale of the project is, what the purpose of the project is for kind of what grant would be the best fit for that. But there are a lot of opportunities for nonprofits who are interested in that. And I'm happy if you want to send me an email afterward and give me some more information to try to connect you with something that could be beneficial there.
All right, next question is from Chris. To what degree does vegetation help with erosion control? I have forest trails that also serve as fire breaks on my farm that were newly built.
Yeah, so vegetation can be helpful as long as it's something that's controllable. So making sure that it's not something that will grow up and get in the path of the trail. You want to make sure that you have that clear corridor. But so that's why some of that ground cover is fine. So it kind of depends on the vegetation and where it is. Where you want to be concerned with vegetation is if you have any of that dipping that happens when you're trying to do that outsloping. So with kind of that walking in the center, once you get those vegetation built up on that berm, then you have kind of a flow of water that can go there. So it depends on where it is and how it is. It's a lot of depending here with trail building.
Next question is from James Comer. Do you recommend any particular materials added to nature trails, such as mulch?
Yeah, that depends on what sort of soil types you have there. So if it's really sandy, you're going to want to add something to a lot of those trails just so it will help with the erosion. So mulch is a great option. Some people like to do pea gravel or some sort of gravelly substance. But yeah, it's whatever is affordable for you, and makes sense for whatever your overall plan is with your property there, making sure that you're always going back to the goal of your property when you're thinking about what sort of additives to put into your trail building.
Anonymous attendee asked how much money's needed.
So I found some estimated spreadsheets that were somewhat dated, but they were for more local and municipal groups. I was trying to find something that I could show because they were thinking about building greenways essentially. And so the cost was in the tens of thousands. For a trail on your property, it depends on how long it is, but it will take some time and maintenance, but it really shouldn't be a big cost burden. And you can find something that might be able to fit that budget depending on what it is. I did really try to find some sort of resource for that because I knew it would be a question, but I couldn't find anything for the private property owner.
From Tara, there are a few locations on our property that will need small footbridges. What resources are available to help with this construction, or should we contract out for this?
Yeah, I think reading up a little bit more about footbridges. So I would look at that resource with the American Trails because they have all sorts of resources when you really get into thinking about building these different footbridges or other sort of pathways over water, and see if it's something that you think you would be able to do safely. And if not, then that's when I would certainly contract out to some group. And it might be good to just have somebody come and look at your property to give an estimate to see how much that might cost, and then thinking about how much it might cost you with time and effort to really make sure that you're doing a safe build there.
All right, the next question from an anonymous attendee is, what about riparian buffers?
Yeah, riparian buffers are not an area that I'm going to pretend that I'm strong in my knowledge, so I can look up to find some areas for you to find that. I would go look at that American Trails website and see what they have about that information, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in that area when I am not.
All right, from Alan Gullimore, many tree farm lease hunting rights for a revenue stream. Is there any comparable model for trail use, and what issues or benefit might exist for this approach?
So comparable models for having people come on their property and pay to hike?
Yeah, I think pay to use the trails for recreational purposes on the property, similar to what tree farm people do for leasing hunting rights.
Yeah, I think there are some examples when you start looking at like agritourism farms and hiking. So some of those places in Vermont with like cross-country skiing and whatnot, I think would be the most similar that you could look to see how you value that. And we have a lot of resources at NC State for if you're looking at activities. Whether or not they're qualified as agritourism is a different conversation. But thinking about how you could potentially figure out how to value those activities for if you're selling it. And then obviously you'd want to make sure that you're working with your lawyer and your insurance, if those are options, to make sure that you're protected in case anything happens there is important. But there are models. I would look through that book, the Farm-Based Education Network, and see those that are doing that cross-country skiing and whatnot to see how they're doing it. And then if you're interested in some of the resources that have been developed with the local food program team on agritourism, then I'd be happy to share those with you.
All right, here's a question from Daryl Moore. Is there a minimum property size for trail installation?
I'm not sure if there's a minimal size. It depends on how minimal your trail wants to be. It is good practice, though, to try to keep your trail at least 100 feet from the neighbor's property. So keeping that in mind, if you only have 100 feet in between, is it worth building a trail? But if there's something out there that you want to build around, then by all means, that's up to you.
All right. At this time, we don't have any more questions. Do have a comment in our chat. in which, Suzanne pointed out that Boy Scouts are always a good resource for hard work. I would include Girl Scouts into that also.
Yeah.
Oftentimes scout groups are looking for ways, especially on public properties, for opportunities to volunteer and things. So
Yeah.
we did get a question from CH Conover. What is the purpose of the 100-foot buffer from the neighbors?
I'm not sure. It could be something about what the neighbors might be doing on their property. Just making sure that you have kind of that space. Also, just, yeah, I don't know. It's just good practice to have that separation from the property there.
Yeah, probably just to give you that peace and quiet that you might want while you're out walking on the trails and stuff.
Yeah, and safety. Sometimes people have a misconception about when you start getting too close about whether or not you're on their property. So just being sure that there's a buffer there to keep you safe.
All right. Dale has asked if you could please repeat the name of the book you mentioned.
The book, so the University of Vermont Farm-Based Education Network is one book that was there. And then the American Trails is a website that I referenced quite a bit. And they have just a slew of resources and webinars and research that comes up. So a great place to look. And like I mentioned, a lot of that is really focused at land managers for public property, but there's a lot that could be applied for private.
And as mentioned earlier, all these web resources that Anne has mentioned are on the portal page, and I've shared that a couple times now in the chat. And here's one more time with the link to the portal page that you can get to those resources and everything. All right, this time we don't have any more questions or comments, it looks like. This would be the time if anybody has one, we could still take it. From Gail, she's wondering if there's any resources to other state topo maps.
Yeah, Gail, if you send me an email, I can find you a state topo map resource. I think most states have them available. It's just finding where they are.
And I believe the USGS also has topo maps available.
Yeah, a lot of times, even if you look through DOT, they'll have some sort of topo map options. But yeah, I'm sure that it's out there. It's just finding where it's housed in whatever state you're in.
I'm going to put the link for the USGS in the chat for those who are interested. And somebody, Stephen had also put in a link. I'm going to copy that and put that in the chat for those. And then Sandra is wondering if you could share your email address with me.
Yeah, I put it in the chat.
Okay.
And my email is also on those presentations. So if you pull up the presentation and a question comes up, feel free to let me know.
So Carl's wondering, are there any thoughts about the legal ramification on trail development?
Legal ramification on what part of trail development? Carl, I need a little more information.
So we'll give Carl a chance to do that. And Jeff, he's pointed out you can also ask your local USDA NRCS, which is your Natural Resource Conservation Service office, for a topographic map. And in reference to Carl's question, he says right-of-way, safety, etc.
Yeah, if you are looking to have public onto your property for trail development, I think it's always good to pull your local zoning and planning officials in pretty early, because that's one of the things they're going to want to know. You might fall under a special use permit if they technically say that it's an agricultural district or whatnot. So making sure you work with them. Generally, they'll want a plan that shows that's safe, that you've thought through all these different safety factors. Like how will people enter and exit? Are you on a busy highway? Is there a way that makes sense for people to get there? So just having those conversations early to see if it's something that's actually plausible is always something that I would urge you to do if you're looking into it. That's I think the best way to handle some of that. And then obviously always talk to your lawyer, make sure they're aware of any of these conversations you're having, and aware of really what the activities are that you're planning to do as a way to make sure that you can be protected, or protecting your property or your business or whatnot the best you can.
I would say if you, for those that aren't, well, even if you're in North Carolina, if you got questions about land ownership and liability related to your forest land, reach out to your local extension office. The extension agents are a wealth of information and resources and can connect you with the people that can help answer questions that are more specific to your local government or your state.
Yeah. Great suggestion, Bob.
All right. Like to thank everybody for participating today. We've almost to the end of the hour, and it looks like we're out of questions. So with that, Ann, thank you for taking the time to put all this together and presenting today. It was a great presentation. And Leslie, thanks to the North Carolina Tree Farm Program for pulling this webinar together and sharing it with our international audience, because I do know we have folks here from India and other places as well as the United States. So I'd like to thank everybody for participating.